Testing, one, two, three. Testing. Hello. Hey. Hello. Hello. Am I on? Can you hear me? Shalom, y'all. Would you sit down, please? Come on into this wonderful place. Have a seat. Be quiet, and I'll begin teaching. It is good to see you on this Lord's Day. Glad you're here. We are in the Gospel of Luke. And I didn't hear a hallelujah or anything, out of Isaiah and into Luke. Anyway, next week I will be in North Carolina, and so we'll have a pause in Luke, but our brother Chris Lloyd is going to be teaching our class. You may not know him because he's always in the back sound room, but I'm happy that he agreed to teach. One of our graduates from Faulkner invited me. They're having a sort of an area-wide lectureship, church lectureship. They have lots of churches involved, so he asked me to come and speak a couple of times. So I was delighted to hear from him and for him to ask me. So we're looking forward to that. Anyway, so I've had to think about the continuity of the class, being that we'll miss next week in Luke. I've told Chris to teach whatever you want, so there's no telling what's going to happen here next Sunday morning. But anyway, we're going to be in Luke 1, and Luke chapter 1 through verse 1 through verse 4, we're going to probably have 2 to 3 lessons around these 4 verses. And the reason is because it is what we might refer to as Luke's prologue, the introduction to his gospel. And what he says in these 4 chapters is very profound and deep and sets the stage of how he's going to organize his presentation of Jesus, and interesting things that he says. But what I want to do this morning is to read these first 4 verses and point out some of the things that next time we get together, I'll spend more time relating to the other aspects of these 4 verses. But what I want to key in on this morning is Luke. Who is this guy that we call Luke? There's lots of interesting observations about Luke. Some you probably know, and some maybe you haven't heard before or seen before. And so I want us to sort of look at Luke himself, because we're reading the gospel that he wrote, and it's a good thing to know something about the person who is writing. It gives you a greater appreciation for what is written. Not only is it inspired, of course, but understanding the background of Luke kind of makes an impression on you when you understand who he is. So let's begin in Luke chapter 1, starting in verse 1. This is his introduction to the gospel. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the Lord, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. Now, just in the reading of this, what stands out in your mind about what he says concerning the introduction of his presentation of the gospel? What did you notice that seemed to be important things in this? Anybody?
There was a group of, or I say group, there was a number of oral stories that were about Jesus and his teaching that was always circulating in Scripture.
Yeah. So one of the things that we will explore is, I know Luke is inspired. What does that mean? Does that allow someone to do what? Investigate everything carefully? I thought an inspiration, you didn't have to work at it. You didn't have to do any research stuff. You just it just came out and you wrote, the Holy Spirit, you can't stop it. Well, that's not what inspiration is. Inspiration is in one way, it's a mysterious providential activity of God that cannot be fully, I think, explained as to the connection of God and the human writer. It's not the kind of inspiration that we would talk about as, one of these mornings, I guess, in relationship to school, we're in the accreditation process. I will be inspired to write drafts for the standards of accreditation. And I say that because I am so behind in doing that. And David is a co-drafter with me, and he's kind of been waiting around for weeks for something to do. And I just, every time I start to do it, I stand up, go outside, mow the lawn. It's kind of, I'm not inspired. So it's not that kind of inspiration. Now, I will get inspired probably when the dean talks to me and says, Scott, you've got to do this, or you're out of here. Then I'll get in there and really, get it out. Anyway, that's not the kind of inspiration we're talking about. The inspiration, when the Bible talks about it, is the idea of God. It's the word that's used by Paul to Timothy is God-breathed. It's the exhale of the Spirit of God. It's kind of like, you breathe in. That's God-breathed. That's inspiration. In other words, it's God's working through the human writers, and the project that they're doing is providentially being guided, and the final product is that which God wanted from them. If it were just mechanical, that is, God, took hold of me and got my hand and started, writing, that would be what we call a mechanical inspiration. It's just God's taken over, it's not me. I'm using everything that God is, his words, his selection, how he would write and whatever the language it is that he's doing, it would be mechanical. I'd have no control over it. But that's not what we see. If that were mechanical, then we would probably assume that why would we need 4 Gospels? They would all be the same, if it were mechanical, if that's what God wanted to do. But what we learn is when you look at every book of the Bible, it is different from every other book because there's a different author, different time. And even among the Gospels, even though 3 of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call synoptic Gospels, and that's because these 3 are so closely similar. Okay, so there's the synoptic Gospels, but they are dissimilar as well. And you would think, why would you need, 3 accounts that are kind of similar? Don't they say the same thing? Well, yes and no. They complement each other. And then you have John kind of out here that's a little bit different from the others. But you have 4 Gospels. It's like in the Old Testament, everything was confirmed by 2 or 3 what? Witnesses. That was sort of the governing principle. Well, God gave us 3 plus 1. I mean, we got 4 witnesses to the life, ministry, and teachings of Jesus. So in that respect, we have that which is sufficient for us to understand. Now, go ahead.
Do you think with this also that God
Yeah, that's what I'm getting to in regard to Luke. Luke is interesting because he actually states that he investigated. He went and found eyewitnesses. He had also access to other probably Gospels like Matthew and Mark that he is familiar with, and that's been an interesting understanding of what Luke is doing, you know. So he's sort of committed to this investigation, this research, and what else do you see? So I guess my conclusion on the inspiration is that God does not take away or take over our abilities, our vocabulary, the way that we write, because the writings in the New Testament, in the original, they're different. I mean, I can recognize when Mark is writing and how different he is from Luke. And just as you can, when you read English, you can recognize someone's writing. You know, when I get papers from school, one of the greatest tests of how I know that the student didn't do their work or they plagiarized or something is because I know they're writing and I'm seeing this and I'm going, that's not you, sorry. This isn't you, because the way that you're presenting it and how you do things and structures, I'm so familiar with your writing as a student that I come to this and I say, we got a problem, we need to talk about this. What happened here? What's going on? And I find out that they cut and pasted off the internet. You know, that gets you in trouble, you know. So those telltale signs are significant. Go ahead.
Now, Luke was a doctor, an educator,
Yeah.
whereas the apostles were Acts 4:13 were untrained and uneducated. And one of my sons, not Nick, told me that they were that they couldn't even read or write because they were fishermen.
Well,
And so in that case, they certainly didn't study the languages
yeah.
that they were able to speak. So God does take over in that sense that they were able to write in a way that is knowledgeable and be able to speak languages they never.
Yeah. In those particular instances, yeah. The reading and writing in the first century, when it says they were untrained and educated, that was a derogatory slap against them because they were all Galileans. It didn't mean necessarily they had no abilities to write or read. In fact, the opposite in my research is there were a lot of people who were literate in reading and writing. They were indicating, too, about being uneducated. These were Jews who didn't recognize them as sophisticated rabbis. They weren't, you know, if you were educated, you were from Jerusalem in the Orthodox Judea. Being away, you know, you didn't have the training of the rabbis and stuff. So I would say yes and no to that. Go ahead.
It's similar to this day and time when somebody doesn't go to Ivy League school.
Yeah.
A lot of times people think you're not educated. Even
Yeah.
though you've got degrees from accredited schools, you're not educated because you didn't go to our school.
Yeah.
That's
That's
the way
one
I understand it.
attitude. Or you didn't go to college at all. So, you know, some would have the hubris that you have nothing to contribute because you're not, quote, educated. Whereas that would imply from their standpoint that you have nothing to contribute, but the person doesn't mean that they're illiterate. Go ahead.
But some people think that he wasn't actually writing for the office of Bethlehem Hall, and that he was actually defending Paul
Yeah.
against the charges that were.
Yeah, and you're getting way ahead on that because. Yeah, well, I did, didn't I? Okay, well, Theophilus. We'll get into that because the letter is written to a quote-unquote Theophilus, which means, in its basic translation, a lover of God, and calls him most excellent. Yes, Charlie?
Can't we say that the Holy Spirit chose from the vocabulary of each writer
Yes.
words to express the truth?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. that's what I was indicating. The inspiration is the utilization and the connection of God and the human writer. And God uses their abilities, okay, guides them in who they are to bring about that which he desires, he wants. So on that level, God is working through providentially. And that's why I would say there's a mystery to it. It's not mechanical, but it's providential. How does God work providentially? That's one of the things we always say. We don't know, but we know God works, right? I can't say this and that, but I know he's active in our world. But inspiration is the cooperation of the human writer and God. It's not like the human writer says, well, God, I don't think that word is the right one. Let's use this one. It's deeper than that, and God working and guiding. But the Bible says that it is God-breathed. So I have to kind of think and define or understand what inspiration means. Because if I have a mechanical thing, it doesn't make sense that Luke would have to go and research things. You know what I'm saying?
Even if you look at the Greek, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, just comparing them side by side, all of them are different styles.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
If it was mechanical dictation, that means everybody would write it exactly the same style, exactly the same words. But John is a lot different from Mark.
Yeah.
Mark's a lot different from Luke. Luke's a lot different from Matthew.
Yeah, that's what I was indicating in regard to the books of the Bible. That you could even tell if you read it in English. If you're immersed in the English, you can kind of see ways in which the authors express the will of God. So the reason I bring that up is because we're going to look at providence in regard to Luke's work in his investigation and research. So he's admitting by this that he's consulting things. He's going to eyewitnesses, what's been written previously, which is probably, there's already been probably 2 Gospels, Mark and Matthew, that are circulating. So why does Luke all of a sudden want to write one? Isn't 2 enough? Why a third? Well, it's all by the providence of God. Anything else in the text that you saw that was kind of interesting? Let me ask you this. How does Luke describe the structure of his presentation in these passages? An orderly, he says, it's going to be an orderly presentation. So from the outset, that would kind of bring to mind that there's going to be some kind of structure that Luke's going to gather his material in, his research and stuff like that, and write his gospel. Do you see anything about the purpose for why he's writing?
So that you may know the exact truth.
Yeah, the exact truth. Now, what's going to be interesting is when we learn a little bit more about Luke, why this is important and kind of fascinating from the standpoint of Luke. Wasn't the previous Gospels that had been written, weren't they the exact truth? Did Luke have in mind, hey, Matthew and Mark, they were right in some areas, they weren't totally right in this area, so he's going to correct it all. Is that what he means? No, we'll talk about that next time, but I wanted you to think about it. Anything else? Well, yeah. The interesting thing, what was said was that perhaps, more detail being given, and that's true in some instances. But Mark being the shortest book, okay, when he describes something, he gives the most detail of the other Gospels, which is kind of interesting. You think that it's an abbreviated Gospel because you look at Luke and Mark. I mean, 16 chapter, 24, it's kind of a difference. Yes, Winnie? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Romans 15, verse 4, the things which are written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. So there's a source, things that were written beforehand. It was mentioned that in Hebrews 12, we have a cloud of witnesses, in regard to those who lived faithfully to God. So God hasn't left us alone. 2 Peter chapter 1 talks about that. In his power, he's granted unto us all things pertaining to life and godliness. So we have sufficiency. What we have is sufficient. Nothing else is required. We don't need a new revelation, someone coming up with new ideas, new things. We have what we need to be God's people. Anything else that you see? Notice, we'll talk about it later, but notice that things which have been handed down to us. What does that say about Luke?
He was not an eyewitness.
Luke wasn't an eyewitness. We'll learn a little bit later that, he's of a different generation. So it becomes very interesting to me and kind of encouraging that you have a non-eyewitness who the Lord works through in his investigation to bring together a presentation concerning Jesus. Now, there must have been some, some gap, if I can use that word, in the biographies of Christ. And what I mean by that, each of the Gospels has their intent and purpose, their audience that they're writing to. And we have on occasions discussed that. Matthew is very Jewish, and he's the one that connects the ministry of Jesus to Old Testament prophecy. You'll read in Matthew, even though it's present in the other Gospels, but Matthew is the one that says, this is that which was fulfilled. This is fulfilled according to Isaiah the prophet. This stands, he's always saying, whatever Jesus does is a fulfillment. Well, who would be interested in that? Well, the Jewish people. He's trying to reach a group of people that have knowledge of the Old Testament. And he's wanting to show that Jesus is not a heretic or a rebel or someone who's leading people astray. He is the very one that the Old Testament talked about. So then you have, the Gospel of Mark. It's totally different characteristic than Matthew is. And the way that Mark presents Jesus in the terms that he uses, a lot of Latinisms, a lot of things that the Roman Empire, Romans would be interested in. Power, the miraculous things, action. These are catered toward the Roman mind, the audience. And when Jesus in Mark chapter 5 deals with a man who's possessed of the Spirit, do you remember what the Spirit identified himself as? Legion. And he's cowering before Jesus. What does that say in regard to Jesus and Rome? So there's a particular purpose behind Mark's writing. So now we get to Luke. Is there a gap that's missing? So we got the Romans covered. We have the Jews covered with Matthew. Is there another group class people, ethnicity, or whatever that needs to be sort of connected with to show who Jesus is. It's not that anybody can't read Mark or Matthew and not be impacted by it, but Luke's audience. We learn about Luke's audience, we'll notice next time we get together, by what he emphasizes that the others don't. And we start to see Luke focuses on those who are powerless, who have been rejected for whatever reason. He focuses on people who have been marginalized by Judaism. It's in Luke that we see the elevation of women in the ministry of Jesus. And we'll talk more about that when we get there. Luke has an audience of the disadvantaged, those who are, not of the in crowd. It's sort of he's addressing the outer limits of those in society who seem to have no hope. Samaritans, sinners, people of the land as they were looked at by the Jewish elitists. That's what they referred to in a derogatory way. If you weren't a Pharisee or one who was known to be this rigid, orthodox religious person, then you were a sinner. That's who they described as sinners. They didn't see themselves as sinners, So Jesus comes out and he really destroys their attitude. But we see a different emphasis. Each of the Gospels have a different emphasis in what they're highlighting. This is why we have, as much as I would like to look at the chronology of Jesus and put everything in order, that's not how we need to read the Gospels. What came first, what came next. In some places, the writers are not interested that much necessarily in chronology as they are in theology, in the teaching, the religious understanding of certain events. And so a lot of times they group similar themes together of different episodes in order to make an impact or an impression upon the reader. Now, Luke's going to be a little bit different because the question that we'll raise is he an historian? How accurate is he? How are we to look at him in writing his gospel? So, all of those things. But the two things I want to focus on in Luke chapter 1 and verse 1 is, you see I have highlighted the word me there. It was fitting for me, okay? And then the next highlighted is to write. So I want to focus on the me. Who is Luke? So I have somewhat of a different opinion from some, and this is not a faith issue, but it is what I've come to understand the ethnicity of Luke in my studies and research. But normally, people identify Luke as a Gentile. I don't think he was a Gentile. I think he was like Paul. He was what we would call a Hellenistic Jew. A Hellenistic Jew is a Jewish, ethnic. They are Jewish, but they are outside of Jerusalem. They speak Greek. They have some of the culture of Greek. It's noticeable. And the reason I say that, in Acts chapter 6, one of the first disturbances in the early church was when Hellenistic Jews came on the day of Pentecost, in Acts chapter 2, from all over the Roman Empire. The gospel was preached, and, that first day, about how many were added to the church saved that day? About 3,000, right? And the question is, well, then they went home, right? They didn't. And then the church by Acts chapter 5 has grown to 5,000. And, so it keeps growing in the people in this new understanding of the kingdom and the church. They're not going home. Would you please go home? You have a standard rule when you visit somebody. It's kind of like 3 days is the max, and then you need to head on out. These people are lingering. They're not going back to their homes in the various places and regions throughout the Roman Empire that they traveled from to Jerusalem. So, what do you think begins to emerge as a problem? Acts chapter 6. How are these people going to eat, for one thing? Okay, where are they going to stay? What are they doing? They're probably all camped out, and they're just not going home. So the church started to do a daily distribution of what? Anybody? Everybody? Of food. Okay, so they had they were providing the needs, and people were selling actually property and various things, and they would bring the money to the apostles. It would be distributed to anyone who had need. Well, anyone who had need is referring to those who are not going. They're all here. And so a disturbance, a dispute broke out in the church. This is the early church, Acts chapter 6, between who? The Hebrew-speaking Jews from Jerusalem and Judea, and the Greek-speaking Jews who were the Hellenist Jews. They spoke Greek. A dispute broke out between these two groups. The Greek speakers said, hey guys, you're overlooking our widows in the daily distribution of food. The Hebrew Jews said, no, we're not. So there's a battle going on. Whether it was real or perceived, we're not told. It was true, though, to them. So what did the church do? The elders called the congregation of people. Think of all those people. And said, choose among you 7 men who meet these qualifications that we can put in charge of this work. And they chose 7. 7 Hellenists, Greek speakers, to take care, to make sure things were equitable. And after that happened, the church grew, the problem was solved, and there was no more dispute. Now, there's another dispute that comes between the Orthodox Jews, a segment called the Circumcision Party, who just could not, they were so tethered to the law of Moses, it was just hard for them to understand that the old law has been put away and we have the law of Christ. And so they're called the Circumcision Party. So you had an element in the Orthodox Jews who were very, very persnickety about Jewish things that were causing trouble in the church. Acts chapter 15, we have another gathering of God's people who address that issue. And they come out of that saying, look, y'all need to quit trying to bind Moses upon the Gentiles. They're Christians just like we are. But let's encourage the Gentiles to be sensitive to Jewish customs. So that's another element that occurred in the early church. So the reason I think Luke is a Hellenistic Jew like Paul, a Greek-speaking Jew, is because, number one, his gospel. It's the highest in literary Greek that we have as representation in the Bible. Not only that, though, you say, well, a Gentile would have that ability if he speaks Greek. Yeah, but also it reveals an intimacy with Judaism. And we refer to that as Semitic, a Semitic understanding, a Jewish understanding of things that I don't think a God-fearer or a Gentile would have. There's a knowledge that he has, and the way that he crafts the language and the Jewish understanding of things I can't see him as a Gentile in this early stage of the church. So that's a thing. So as I said, I won't disfellowship you if you believe he's a Gentile, but we will not have table fellowship together. The other letter, or the other two in the New Testament that are similar to Luke, is the book of Acts. Well, that makes sense because Luke wrote Acts. That's for another discussion. The other one is the book of Hebrews, which I believe Luke was Paul's amanuensis in his writing. You know, the New Testament writers a lot used a scribe or an amanuensis that would write down what Paul was saying. And I think Luke was Paul's amanuensis. So in a sense, Paul wrote Luke, okay, but it was Luke who wrote it. In other words, Paul is using him to write. And the style and the language of Hebrews and Acts and Luke are just, they're the top in the New Testament concerning the Greek language and even the depth of knowledge of, Jewish understanding and concepts of things. So that's my reason. Another thing that we see about Luke, his ethnicity is parallel to the Apostle Paul. I mean, we don't have any problem looking at Paul as a Hellenist Jew. He's able to navigate among Greeks and Jewish people. He has that ability in understanding and in concept, and he even knows the poets of Gentiles, of Greeks. When he goes to Athens and he argues with the philosopher, he just enters and starts arguing and presenting. And that's just incredible to me. There's probably no situation that Paul could be in that would, stump him in a way that he would not have knowledge about, because he was highly educated, both in Greek as well as Judaism. But I think Luke is similar to him. Paul lists and talks about Luke on several occasions. Philemon 24, Paul identifies him as a fellow worker. So he's among Paul's fellow workers. Luke refers to him in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 11 in Paul's last letter that he penned before he dies. He says, there's one who stands with me alone. And who is it? It's Luke. Luke is here. Others have departed, but Luke is his faithful companion, the one that is there with him. In Colossians 4 and verse 14, this is where we get the beloved physician. Luke's called the beloved physician. Now, there is an element of people who say, well, he's not really a doctor. It's just that he was a physician of souls. That's how he was described. But I don't believe that to be true because of the next point. Number 2, he was a physician. The term in the original, iatros, is the word for physician. And it is a professional designation that refers to one who engages in practice of helping people with their ailments. Luke 4, verse 23, when Jesus is in Nazareth in a synagogue, when he knows he's not going to be accepted by his hometown, he said, surely you will say, quote this, heal thyself, physician. And the word used there is the same word here. It's a reference to a one who is medically, inclined, medically practicing things. An interesting thing, I want you to look at Luke chapter 8, verse 43. I don't know. Some translations have it, some don't. This is about the woman who had the hemorrhaging of blood for 12 years. And, of course, she's desperate at the time. And one of the things that happened is that she spent everything that she had on physicians and was not helped. And so in verse 43 we have, and a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone. Okay? Do y'all have anything else after that? My translation stops there. Do you have anything else that continues? Anybody? Okay, you have, what version are you reading? Okay, English Standard Version puts it in. There's a, this is what we call as a variant. In all the manuscripts, that phrase does not appear in the best manuscripts. And you wonder, well, how did it come about? Well, I think a scribe was harmonizing what Mark says and added it to this section in Luke to explain why, explain the background a little bit about this woman seeking help from physicians. Mine, the New American Standard, doesn't even have it here. It has a footnote. You know, some manuscripts have this. She spent everything with physicians. Okay. So in a lot of the Bibles, it's not even there. What's the issue? Well, I think it goes back to Mark chapter 5. Okay. This is kind of interesting, but Mark chapter 5 in verse 26, in the parallel account, Mark has this to say: a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured, notice what it says, and had endured much at the hands of physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. What's her opinion about the medical community? See, Mark provides this, that she went to all these iatroses, these doctors, and spent everything that she had, and nobody could help her. In fact, she had gone worse. You've ever experienced that? It is called a medical practice, by the way. Well, this is kind of humorous. It'd be an interesting discussion. But what is Luke? He's a physician. Could it be that Luke did not include this? This derogatory statement about physicians in his gospel? That's some of the interesting things that we kind of think about. Well, I don't know. You say, well, now you're getting into, did God want it there or should it be there? Well, from my understanding of the manuscripts, it was added later in Luke. And I think what's happened, which is not surprising, that a scribe is harmonizing Mark and Luke. But the manuscripts, the majority of them, the most, should I say it, the most accurate that we would have, does not have this statement in Luke. So it's not surprising that maybe Luke had a little bit of different opinion about doctors than Mark did. And I'm not saying Mark had a suspicious view of the medical community, but it is kind of funny, isn't it, that it's not there in most manuscripts and Luke's portrayal of the episode. And then I got to thinking, Luke's a doctor. All right, what do y'all feel about that? Isn't that interesting? Kind of glazed in the eyes. Okay. Medical practice, some are surprised. Some indicate that there's no way of him being a doctor and all this, but medical practice had advanced substantially by the time of Luke. Herophilus, 3rd century BC, was the first doctor to dissect human bodies. Erasistratus was the first doctor to maintain that the human body was composed of atoms. Heraclides, 1st century BC, was the first doctor to explore the science of pharmacology. Soranus, the 2nd century AD, was the first doctor to specialize in gynecology and obstetrics. We have a medical lady here who is among us that can confirm or deny what was just stated. But this is what I had gathered from my research concerning medical practice, which dates back a long time ago. Now, we'll have to call it an end, so I'll have to pick up with the next one. The thing that interests me that's about Luke is that it's not necessarily that his language is medical language that no one would use. No, these are not special things that he says medically. But what's interesting about Luke is that he has a heightened sensitivity to medical things. He seeks to be more precise and accurate concerning the health of individuals, as opposed to the way Matthew and Mark will describe a situation. So in that, you begin to look, well, this makes sense that Luke is a medical doctor. It's another corroborating evidence about him, because when he describes something, he's more precise. And he gives you a little bit more, not that it's profound or anything, but the others don't do that. There's a leper. Luke said he was covered with leprosy. That's a little bit different than just identifying a leper. Well, what part of him? Luke says, and the way he writes it, gives us a more precise understanding of the condition of this individual. And that sort of kind of connects or affirms the fact of Luke's interest being a physician. Okay, that's it. Thank you.